The morning Clifford Bates drove back into Harlan County, Kentucky. He had $43 in his wallet, a duffel bag in the back seat, and a Belgian Malinois named Scout riding shotgun, with his nose pressed flat against the passenger window. He hadn't been back in 11 years. The hills rose up on both sides of the two-lane road the way he remembered them, dark green and close, like walls that had been waiting. The fog sat low in the hollows. A hawk circled somewhere above the tree line. Clifford watched it through the windshield without really seeing it, his hands steady on the wheel the way they always were. The way the Army had made them, even when everything else was falling apart. He was 64 years old. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in the Gulf. He had buried a wife, raised a son alone, worked 30 years as a site foreman for a construction company in Lexington. And 3 weeks ago, he had been walked out of that office by a man half his age who told him he was no longer needed, that the numbers didn't work, that the company was restructuring. He hadn't argued. Clifford Bates had never been a man who argued. He had driven home, sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looked around at the apartment he could no longer afford on unemployment, and decided to go back to the only place he had ever truly understood. His father's farmhouse outside Harlan, empty now for 6 years, since the old man passed. Scout turned from the window and looked at him. The dog was 9 years old, tawny and lean, with ears that stood like 2 small flags and eyes that missed nothing. Clifford had gotten him from a rescue organization that worked with veterans. They had been together 7 years. "Almost there," Clifford said. Scout turned back to the window. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane off Route 119, behind a stand of black locust trees that had grown up thick and tangled in the years since anyone had kept them back. Clifford pulled in slowly, gravel popping under the tires, and stopped in front of the house. He sat there for a moment with the engine running. The porch was sagging at one corner. The paint had gone gray and was peeling in long strips. One of the upstairs windows had a crack running diagonally across it, taped from the inside with what looked like old electrical tape, probably something his father had done years ago, and never gotten around to fixing. The flower beds his mother had kept along the front were all weeds now, tall and gone to seed. It looked like a place that had given up. He turned off the engine. "All right," he said, to himself or to the dog, he wasn't sure which. Inside smelled like dust and closed-up time. The furniture was all still there, covered in old sheets. His father's neighbor, a woman named June who had kept an eye on the place, had laid over everything before she'd locked it up. Clifford walked through the room slowly. The kitchen, the front room with the wood stove, his father's bedroom at the back, his own old room, smaller than he remembered, with a water stain on the ceiling he didn't recognize. He stood in the doorway of his old room for a while. There was a photograph on the dresser that he hadn't expected. Him in uniform, young, the summer before he shipped out the first time. He looked like someone else entirely. He looked like someone who didn't yet know what was coming. He went back to the car and got Scout and his duffel bag. That first night, he slept on the old couch in the front room, with Scout curled at his feet, and he stared at the dark ceiling for a long time before sleep came. He thought about the job, about the way the HR manager, a young woman named Tessa, had not been able to look at him while she explained the severance package, about the apartment he had given up, the furniture he had sold or left behind, about his son Daniel, who lived in Portland now with his wife and 2 kids, and who had offered, carefully, to help, and whom Clifford had told, just as carefully, that he was fine. He was not fine. But he had never been a man who let other people carry his weight for him. That was the thing about being a certain kind of man from a certain kind of place. You didn't put it on other people. You figured it out yourself or you didn't, and either way, it was yours. Scout shifted at his feet, resettled, and let out a long, slow breath. Clifford closed his eyes. In the morning, he took inventory. The well pump still worked, which was luck. The propane tank outside was empty, which was not. The wood stove in the front room was functional. and there was a half cord of old split oak stacked under the overhang at the side of the house, dry enough to burn. He found a box of matches in the kitchen drawer, right where his father had always kept them. He found a can of coffee and a can of peaches in the back of a cabinet. He made coffee on the wood stove, standing in the kitchen in the gray morning light, and he thought about what $43 would need to do. Scout moved around the property, while Clifford stood on the porch and drank his coffee. The dog covered the yard in long, easy loops, nose working the ground, ears swiveling. He went out to the edge of the field, came back, went around the side of the barn, and disappeared. Clifford waited. Scout didn't come back. After a few minutes, Clifford set down his mug and walked around the side of the house. The barn stood about 60 yards back from the house. A tobacco barn. Old. The boards weathered almost black. His father had used it for equipment storage in the later years, after he'd gotten out of farming. The door was standing open. Clifford didn't remember leaving it open, but the latch had always been unreliable. He stepped inside. The light came in through the gaps in the siding in thin, bright lines, crossing the floor in a pattern of pale stripes. Old equipment sat along the walls, a rusted disc harrow, a hay elevator, a collection of hand tools hanging from nails. It smelled like oil and old hay and something else underneath, something damp and particular, like earth, that hadn't been turned in a long time. Scout was in the back corner. He was digging, not the playful scratching of a bored dog, serious, deliberate, both front paws at a section of the dirt floor, nose down, the muscles across his shoulders moving with purpose. A small pile of loose earth had already built up beside him. Scout. Clifford's voice was quiet. What have you got? The dog didn't stop, didn't even look up. Clifford crouched down beside him and looked at the floor. The dirt there was a different color than the rest, darker, compacted differently. He pressed his palm against it. It was firmer than the surrounding floor, like something had been dug up and refilled at some point, years ago, and had never quite settled back the same way. He went and found his father's old spade hanging on the wall. It took him 20 minutes, digging carefully, to find it. It was a metal strongbox, olive green, military surplus about the size of a shoebox. The lid had a simple latch, not locked. It was wrapped in a heavy plastic garbage bag, the kind his father had bought in bulk from the farm supply store, taped around with electrical tape that had dried and cracked but mostly held. The box itself was in decent shape, some surface rust on the corners, otherwise solid. Clifford sat back on his heels and looked at it for a moment. Scout sat beside him, panting gently, watching his face. You knew that was there, Clifford said. The dog looked at the box. Clifford peeled away the plastic and opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a stack of papers. A letter on top, handwritten, in his father's careful block print. Behind the letter, a thick folder of documents, property surveys, what appeared to be a deed, bank statements, an envelope from a law firm in Harlan. And beneath all of that, a smaller envelope with Clifford's name on it, written in the same hand. He sat there in the dirt of the old barn, Scout pressed warm against his side, and he read. His father had written the letter 4 years before he died. He hadn't told Clifford about it, hadn't told anyone, apparently. In the letter, he explained that he had become aware, through a conversation with a neighbor, a man named Douglas Vance, that there had been a long-running dispute about the back 40 acres of the property, a piece of land that bordered the Vance family's holdings to the east. His father had bought that land in 1971, had the deed recorded, had paid taxes on it for decades, but Douglas Vance, and later Vance's son, Neil, had been quietly claiming, in conversations with the county assessor's office, with local real estate agents, with anyone who would listen, that the boundary survey from 1971 had been inaccurate, that the back 40 had actually been sold to his father in error, and that the Vance family held the original claim. Clifford's father had known. This was false. He had the original deed. He had the surveys. He had decades of tax records. But he had also known that he was old, that his health was failing, and that a legal fight cost money and time and energy he didn't have left. So he had gathered everything, every document, every survey, every tax receipt going back 50 years, and he had put it in this box, and he had buried it in the barn floor, and he had written a letter telling Clifford where it was and why it mattered. Except he had never sent the letter, which meant that for 6 years, the 6 years since his father's death, Neil Vance had been telling anyone who would listen that the back 40 acres of the Bates property rightfully belonged to the Vance family. Had been filing paperwork with the county assessor, had, according to the documents in the folder, actually succeeded in having the property boundary officially adjusted 2 years ago, in a process that Clifford had known nothing about, because he had not been here, because he had been in Lexington working, because no one had told him. Clifford sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. The dust moved in the bright lines of light coming through the barn walls. Scout shifted beside him and put his head on Clifford's knee. 40 acres, his father's land, taken piece by piece through paperwork and patience, and the quiet assumption that no one would ever look too closely. He thought about the $43 in his wallet. He thought about his father's handwriting, careful and even, working through an explanation that must have cost him something to write. He thought about the fact that he had almost not come back here, had thought about going to Daniel in Portland, letting his son take care of him for a while. Had almost done that. He looked at Scout. "Good boy," he said. His voice came out rough. Scout thumped his tail once against the dirt floor. The next morning, Clifford drove into Harlan. He went to the library first, used the public computer to find a legal aid organization that worked with veterans and property disputes out of a small office on Cumberland Avenue. He called the number from his cell phone, standing in the parking lot, the mountains green and heavy on all sides. The woman who answered was named Carol. She had a brisk, matter-of-fact way of talking that he appreciated. He explained the situation. There was a pause on her end. "You said you have the original deed?" she asked. "I have everything," he said. "Surveys, tax records, deed going back to 1971. All of it." Another pause. "Can you come in Thursday?" He was there at 9 o'clock Thursday morning with the strongbox and its contents. The attorney who met with him was a younger man, maybe 35, named Philip Greer, who wore a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up and read through the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. He didn't say much while he read. When he finished, he set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Bates," he said, "Neil Vance's family got that boundary adjustment through because they filed the paperwork during a period when no one was actively monitoring the property, and there was no one here to contest it. That's how it works sometimes." He picked up the original deed. "But this document is clear. The 1971 survey is on file with the state, and you have 50 years of tax payments, which creates a record that's very difficult to argue against." He looked up. "This is going to take some time, but I think we can fix this." Clifford nodded. "There's something else," Philip said. He pulled out a different document from the folder, one Clifford had looked at but not fully understood. A set of bank statements from an account at a Harlan bank, under his father's name. "This account, do you know anything about it?" Clifford shook his head. "I didn't know it existed. According to these statements, your father had been depositing into this account for about 20 years. Small amounts, regular. The last statement is from 2 months before he died." Philip looked at the paper. The balance at that point was a little over $86,000. The room was very quiet. "He never mentioned it," Clifford said. "Banks have protocols for unclaimed accounts belonging to deceased individuals. If no one knew about it and no claim was ever made, it's likely been sitting in the state's unclaimed property fund." Philip set the statement down. "I can help you file a claim. It's a process, but it's straightforward with the documentation you have." Clifford looked at the paper in Philip's hand. His father's name at the top, a number that didn't seem real. He thought about his father working this land for 50 years, getting up early, coming in late, spending carefully the way men of that generation spent, Not because they were afraid, but because they understood that money was just stored work, and work was something you didn't waste. He thought about the strongbox wrapped in its garbage bag, buried under the barn floor. The letter that had never been sent. His father had been trying to protect him. From across time in the only way he knew how. By keeping records, by being careful, by trusting that someday Clifford would come back and find it. He had almost not come back. He drove home through the hills with the windows down, the September air cool and carrying the smell of turning leaves. Scout rode with his head out the window, ears flat, eyes half closed against the wind. And Clifford watched the road and didn't try to make sense of the feeling that had settled over him. It wasn't quite happiness. It was something older than that, something quieter. Back at the farmhouse, he sat on the sagging porch steps, and Scout came and sat beside him, and they stayed there while the light went off the hills and the hollow below filled slowly with shadow. A whippoorwill started up somewhere in the locust trees. Philip called 2 months later. The property case had been filed. The county assessor had reviewed the original deed and survey and agreed to open a formal boundary adjustment of the 2022 boundary adjustment. Neil Vance had hired an attorney of his own, but Philip was not concerned. The documentation was unambiguous. The unclaimed property claim took 4 months. On a cold Thursday in January, Clifford sat in a bank office in Harlan and signed papers, and walked out with access to an account that his father had built dollar by dollar over 20 years of quiet, careful living, $86,000 and change. He sat in his truck in the bank parking lot for a long time before he started the engine. He had called Daniel the night before to tell him what was happening. His son had gone quiet on the other end of the line in a way that said more than words. Then he had said, "Dad, I can't believe he did all that." And Clifford had said, "I can." Because he could, because he had known his father. And this was exactly the kind of man his father had been. Not a man who made speeches or grand gestures, but a man who paid attention and kept records and trusted that doing things right, quietly, over a long period of time, would eventually matter. Scout was in the back seat. He had taken to riding in the back lately, for no particular reason Clifford could identify. The dog caught his eye in the rearview mirror and held it. "You know what you did," Clifford said. Scout looked out the window. The property case was settled the following spring. The boundary adjustment was reversed. The back 40 acres were formally returned to the Bates property record. Neil Vance did not contest the final ruling. Clifford spent that summer fixing the farmhouse. He repaired the porch, replaced the cracked window upstairs, had the propane tank filled, put new paint on the siding, white the color it had been when he was a boy. He planted a garden along the front of the house where his mother's flower beds had been. It wasn't flowers, because Clifford didn't know much about flowers, but he planted tomatoes and beans and a long row of sweet corn that came up straight and tall by August. Daniel brought his family down in July, first time in years. Clifford's grandchildren were 8 and 10, a girl named Emma and a boy named Will. And they were afraid of Scout for approximately 15 minutes before the dog won them over entirely and spent the rest of the week being followed everywhere by 2 children and a great deal of noise. Clifford watched from the porch and drank his coffee and didn't say much and felt something in his chest that he had forgotten was there. One evening, after the kids were in bed, Daniel sat with him on the porch, and they looked out at the hills going dark in the last of the light, and Daniel said, "You could have lost all of this. You almost didn't come back." "I know," Clifford said. "What made you?" Clifford thought about it. "Didn't have anywhere else to go," he said, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he had driven away from Lexington, with a dog in the passenger seat, and $43 and no particular plan, and the only place that had felt like a direction was here. This road, these hills, this house. As if some part of him had known what he was driving toward even when he hadn't. Daniel was quiet for a while. "That dog," he said finally, looking at Scout, who was lying on the porch boards between their chairs, asleep. Yeah, Clifford said. Do you think he actually knew something was in that barn? Clifford looked at the dog, at the steady rise and fall of his ribs. The tawny fur, a little gray around the muzzle now. 9 years old, almost 10. I think he smelled something, Clifford said. I think he followed it. He picked up his coffee. Probably that's all it was. He didn't entirely believe that, but it was close enough to say out loud. The photograph of his young self was still on the dresser in his old room. He had looked at it a few times over the months. The boy in that photograph had shipped out 6 months after it was taken, had come back 2 years later different in ways that took years more to understand, had lived a whole life since, wife, son, work, loss, more work, had ended up here at 64 back in the same hills he had grown up in, sitting on a porch his father had built. He didn't feel sorry for any of it. That surprised him sometimes. He had expected, coming back to this place, to feel the weight of years lost or wasted. Instead, he felt something more like continuity, as if everything had been part of the same road, and the road had brought him here, and here was all right. Here was, in fact, more than all right. On a Saturday in late September, he drove out to the back 40 for the first time. He hadn't been out there in decades. He left the truck at the edge of the field and walked in through the long grass with Scout moving ahead of him, quartering the field in his easy professional way, nose down. The land was overgrown. What had once been a hayfield, now brambles and sumac, and a few young sassafras trees coming up along the fence line. His father's fence posts were still in the ground along the eastern boundary, old cedar posts, still solid. The wire between them had rusted and fallen in places. He walked the fence line to the corner marker, a concrete post set in the ground with the original survey markings still visible on the face of it. He crouched down and looked at it. His father had set this post. He didn't know when exactly, sometime after the 1971 purchase, but his father had set it with his own hands. He put his hand on top of the post. Scout came and stood beside him, looking out across the field. They stayed there for a while, the two of them, in the quiet of the afternoon. The mountains were all around, the way they always had been, blue and endless under a sky that was beginning to take on the thin gold of early autumn. A hawk turned slow circles overhead. The wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. Clifford stood up. He had work to do. The fence needed restringing. The field needed clearing. It would take a couple of seasons to bring it back to anything useful. He was 64 years old and alone, and he didn't know exactly what the plan was, only that there was one. That some piece of ground his father had paid for and protected was his now, legally and completely, and that he intended to take care of it the way his father had taken care of it, which was quietly and thoroughly, and for as long as he was able. Scout looked up at him. "Come on," Clifford said. They walked back through the long grass toward the truck, the dog ranging out and circling back, the hills steady on all sides, the September light warm and clean across everything, and for the first time in a long time, maybe the first time in years, Clifford Bates felt like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be.